This is a quick release valve with anti-compounding, commonly known as a QR-1C. It ensures that your parking brake and service brakes never apply at the same time. You can spot the difference between a regular quick release and one with anti-compounding by looking for this large hex on the front. That means that it has the anti-compounding feature and could possibly lead to some difficult troubleshooting if it ever leaks. In today's video, we'll be going through the process of diagnosing an air leak associated with the QR-1C. The way you'll find a faulty QR-1C valve is if you notice an air leak with the parking brakes released. So that's what we'll do first. Start your truck and build air pressure until the dryer purges, letting you know that your compressor has cut out. This should be somewhere between 120 and 130 psi. Once you hear the dryer purge, shut off the engine, and once it's settled, key on the ignition so you can watch your air gauges. Anyone familiar with the air system leak test procedure should recognize these first steps. Once you're sure the supply system isn't leaking and the gauges haven't dropped any psi in 1 minute, release the parking brake and watch your gauges again. You can see here that this air system is leaking way too much pressure with the brakes released. Spec is no more than 2 psi in 1 minute. So we have a pretty major air leak on this vehicle. Let's run down the possible causes. Since the air leak only surfaced once the parking brake was released, we really only need to focus our efforts on valves associated with the parking brake system. The first one to inspect is the quick release valve, known as the QR-1, or if it has the anti-compounding feature, the QR-1C. This chassis has a QR-1C. If this valve is leaking while the parking brakes are released, there is an issue with the exhaust circuit located within the valve. As air moves through the parking brake circuit coming from the parking brake valve, the next valve in line is the QR-1 or QR-1C. Air enters the valve, seals the exhaust port, and supplies air to each parking brake chamber to release the brakes. Air entering the supply port causes the exhaust diaphragm to close, blocking the exhaust port and forcing the air out of the delivery ports. If there is an air leak in the diaphragm, air can be heard escaping from the exhaust valve with the brakes released. The next valves we need to talk about are the service brake relay and the ABS modulator valves. Air has the potential to leak from the exhaust port of each one of these valves as well, and we'll discuss the modulators first. As air moves from the quick release valve, it goes to the parking brake chamber, and air pressure should stabilize. The diaphragm in the brake chamber could leak, in which you would hear air leaking from the rear of the brake chambers themselves. Another potential air leak the brake chambers could have is the center seal. This seal blocks the two sections of the brake chamber, the parking brake and the service brake. If the center seal is the issue, air will come into the parking brake section and leave through the service brake section. If it is leaking out of the brake chamber, the valve that will actually show this issue is the modulator closest to that brake chamber. The exhaust port of the modulator valve works similarly to the quick release valve. If air comes in through the wrong direction, it will follow the path of least resistance and exit through the exhaust port. This issue is commonly misdiagnosed as a faulty modulator valve. The most common area for that to take place is the brake chamber. So if you notice a modulator leaking during this situation, go check the brake chamber closest to that valve. If it's a driver's side modulator leaking, check the driver's side chamber. Passenger side leaking, check the passenger side chamber. The final valve we'll discuss that could potentially leak with the parking brakes released is the service brake relay valve. Here you can see that the air is leaking from the exhaust port. The relay valves have one supply from the air tanks, then a couple delivery options with a signal line coming from the foot valve. There are many different configurations of modulator and brake chamber placement coming from a relay valve, but if you do happen to have a QR-1C, you will also have a delivery line going to that valve as well. Air gets delivered to the brake chamber simultaneously with air being delivered to the quick release. So let's take a look at the inside of a QR-1C valve. When air is supplied from the parking brake valve, a diaphragm inside the valve moves over to block off the port coming from the service relay. This diaphragm is responsible for blocking airflow to the relay. With the parking brakes applied, air comes from that line on the relay delivery to this port on the QR-1C. Now air moves in the opposite direction and moves the diaphragm over to block off the parking brake line. Here you can see air flowing through this air schematic. But what happens when the diaphragm develops a leak? Air enters the valve from the parking brake circuit and now has a way out of that relay port. If we think back at where that line comes from, we'll get back to the relay valve. Now air is once again going the wrong direction into a valve, so it will again follow the path of least resistance. The only path of escape is the already open exhaust port of the relay. So how do we confirm our diagnosis? First, we'll start by disconnecting this line and seeing if any air comes out of it with the parking brakes released. These are quick disconnect lines, so they're pretty easy to remove and test. Just make sure there's no air in the line before you remove it. Once the line is removed, we'll release the parking brakes and note what happens. Air is coming from the line and not the valve, so we know that for sure the air is coming from the quick release valve. Here you can see the air moving through the QR-1C valve and going to the relay. So we'll move over to the QR-1 valve itself and disconnect the air line going to the relay again. This line on top is the one that goes to the relay, and this one is the line coming from the parking brake valve. We'll disconnect it and see if air exits the valve, indicating a leaking diaphragm. Parking brake is released, and as you can see, air is exiting from the valve itself. So we need to see what's going on inside the QR-1C. Accessing the diaphragm just to check it is pretty easy. We'll first need to remove the line coming from the parking brake valve, and then remove that large hex on the front of the QR-1. Check the diaphragm closely and look for any damage or holes. I removed the diaphragm completely to simulate this issue, so this diaphragm is still good. You can see here that there are no holes in the rubber. Make sure you check this area specifically, as that is where the main sealing takes place. You might be able to find a rebuild kit for this valve, but it's highly likely you'll just replace the entire thing. Valve replacement is pretty self-explanatory, but if you are just replacing the diaphragm, install it back into the QR-1 and make sure it stays upright when threading the cap back on. Give the cap a good snug, then reinstall the parking brake line. We'll now test the valve by releasing the parking brake and removing the line to the relay just as before. With a healthy seal, there should now be no air escaping from the QR-1C. Here is another truck with a similar air system, and here is that compounding line. This is another truck with the compounding line, so once you know what you're looking for, it's relatively easy to spot. I hope you found this video informative, and as always, if you have any suggestions for future video ideas, leave them down in the comment section.